Hello and welcome to the revision video for Religion and Early Life. This is for the Religion and Life Issues paper of AQA Religious Studies B. Before we get started, a couple of admin points to go through. If you see a pen on the screen like this, then it means I want you to write something down. If you've got a pause button on the screen that looks like this, it means you need to pause the video in order to try and write something down. I'll ask you when I want you to do this. Feel free at any time during the video to be able to pause the video. And finally, if you see a timing star like this, it means that I want you to do an exam question under time conditions. Make sure you're really strict with yourself when you're doing these exam questions so that you get the best practice possible for your exam. If at any time during the video you get a bit tired or you feel like your brain won't work anymore, feel free to make a note of where you are in the video, turn it off and come back to it later. We're going to start out with a keywords test. Remember how important knowing the keywords and the definitions are in your exam. Not only do you get marks just for knowing these definitions, but often they'll be the secret to being able to actually access the exam question in the first place. So, write down the keyword that goes with each one of these definitions. Number 1, the deliberate termination or ending of a pregnancy, usually before the fetus is 24 weeks old. 2, the legal process where a person, a child, is taken, adopted, into a family as a son or daughter. 3, the moment the sperm fertilises the egg. 4, a fertilised ovum or human egg at about 12 to 14 days when implanted into the wall of the womb. This is the earliest stage of human development. 5, the point when a fetus receives a soul. Muslims believe this occurs at 120 days. 6, the taking of a child from a different family into a family home and bringing them up with the rest of the new family. The parents in this case do not change legally. 7, this is a fertilised ovum from 8 weeks onwards. 8, the slogan used for a view that supports the right to the life of the fetus. This is against abortions being legal. 9, this is a slogan used for the opposite, the view that women should have the right to choose whether or not to have an abortion. This supports abortions being legal. 10, a measure of fulfilment. This is how good or bad your life is. 11, this is the idea that life is sacred, special and holy because it is God-given. It's been given by God. 12, the point at which a fetus could survive if it were to be born. Now all you need to do is self-assess your work to see how well you've done. Put a tick next to them if they're right and make sure you correct them if they're wrong. The deliberate termination or ending of a pregnancy, usually before the fetus is 24 weeks old, is known as abortion. This is the key word to the whole of this topic. You must know about abortion, you must know what the definition of abortion is in order to be able to access this topic properly. The legal process where a person or child is taken, adopted, into a family as a son or daughter is adoption. It's important here that we notice the fact that this is a legal process where the parents legally change for that child. The moment the sperm fertilises the egg is called conception. This is seen by many as being the very earliest stage that life could be seen to have begun. The fertilised ovum or human egg at about 12 to 14 days when implanted into the wall of the womb, the earliest stages of human development, is the embryo. It's much better if during your exam, rather than referring to a baby being killed, when you're talking about abortion, you refer to the embryo or the fetus being terminated. The point when a fetus receives a soul, Muslims believe this occurs at around 120 days, is known as ensoulment. The taking of one child from a different family into the family home and bringing them up with the rest of the new family, the parents do not change legally, is called fostering. The fertilised ovum from 8 weeks is the fetus. The slogan used for the view that supports the right to life of the fetus, against abortions being legal, is pro-life. The slogan used for the view that women should have the right to choose whether or not to have an abortion, supports abortions being legal, is pro-choice. It's important with this that you remember that they're not in favour of abortion. They just support abortion being legal. This means that women have the choice as to whether they have one, but nobody is in favour of all babies being terminated. The measure of fulfillment, how good or bad your life is the quality of life. The idea that life is sacred, special and holy because it is given by God is the sanctity of life. The point at which a fetus could survive if it was to be born is known as viability. Time for our first surprise keywords test. Write down the definition for abortion. If this was a 2-mark question, you might need to give an example of when somebody might choose to have an abortion as well. Abortion is the deliberate termination or ending of a pregnancy, usually before the fetus is 24 weeks old. An example of why somebody may have an abortion could be because the mother is too young or because the child may have a severe disability. Throughout the video, we'll be looking at some keys to success. These will be teachings that you'll be able to remember that should put you in a really good position to be able to answer pretty much any question in this topic in the exam. The first of these is the sanctity of life. Now, Christians and Muslims both believe that God created all life. This makes it sacred and holy and means that it should always be protected and looked after. On your sheet of paper, I want you to write down how this belief would affect the way that religious people view abortion. You could start off by saying, belief in the sanctity of life will affect a Christian or Muslim's view of abortion because... Pause the video now and write down your answer. Time for another keywords test. Write down the definition for viability. See if you can develop that definition any further. Viability is the point at which a fetus could survive if it were to be born. This is at about 24 weeks, and this is currently where the UK law allows abortion to happen before. One of the big issues in this topic is when life begins. I want you to think about why it's important in a topic where we're looking at abortion to have a clear idea of when life begins. Think about the fact that many people see abortion as killing. Pause the video now and write down about 4 sentences which explain your answer to this question. So life has to have begun before it can be taken. If people disagree with abortion because it's killing, taking a life has to have started for abortion to be considered wrong. If abortion takes place at a point when life hasn't started, then nothing has happened. It can't be seen as killing because you have to have a life to be killed. Time for another keywords test. Write down the definition for conception. See if you can develop your definition. Conception is the moment the sperm fertilises the egg. A possible development of the definition could be to say that this is the earliest possible moment when life could be seen to begin. So let's think about this question of when life begins. As we go through, I want you to think about when you believe that life begins. Try to justify your reasoning with some kind of explanation. Many people believe that life begins at conception. This is the moment that the sperm fertilises the egg. Now, this is a time when many Christians, particularly Catholics, believe that life starts. Before conception, we can't say that there is any life at all. After conception, whatever that grows into can be considered to be a life. The next stage when people think that life could begin is at 21 days. Now, this is the point at which the spinal column and nervous system are formed. This means that the fetus can begin to feel. Many people think that if we're talking about something which can feel, we are talking about something which is alive, and therefore taking its life away would be wrong. The next stage at which people think that life can begin is in the 4th week. This is when the heart begins to beat, or when we have a detectable heartbeat. It makes sense to say that this is the point at which life begins, because when we're checking to see if someone is dead, we check to see whether they have a heartbeat. The next stage at which life can begin is quickening. These are the first detectable movements of the fetus at around 13 weeks. Now, movement is important because it is one of the 7 signs of life. So if we can say that something is moving, we could say that it is alive. The next stage is ensoulment. Now, this is an Islamic idea of when the fetus receives its soul. In Islam, it's between 90 and 120 days. For Muslims, this doesn't mean that life has begun at this stage, but it does mean that the life of the child takes on the same value as the life of the mother at this point. Viability, at about 24 weeks, is the point at which the fetus could potentially survive if it was born. There have been cases of babies being born at 24 weeks where, with lots of medical intervention, they've been able to survive through their childhood. The final stage at which people think that life may begin is at birth. At this point, the baby is in the world and no longer physically attached to the mother. It's no longer reliant on anyone else for its sustenance. This could be when life begins, because it's the point at which it becomes an individual and not simply something within somebody else. Using this information, pause the video and explain when you think that life begins. I want you to give an explanation as to why. Once you've finished that, I want you to think about why somebody else may think differently to you. Time for another keywords test. What is the definition for ensoulment? Can you develop your definition? Ensoulment is the point when a fetus receives a soul. This is a Muslim belief. A development for that definition could be that it happens at around 120 days after conception. Time for us to look at another one of our keys to success. This is a Christian teaching and it's from the Ten Commandments. This one is a really simple one, really easy to remember, and it's do not kill. The Ten Commandments are rules given by God that all Christians believe that they should follow. This means that they should not kill under any circumstances. I want you to pause the video and think about how this belief could affect the way that Christians see abortion. Start your answer by saying, do not kill would affect a Christian's attitude towards abortion because... Pause the video now and think about your view of do not kill. The next thing that we need to look at is the UK law on abortion. This is something that the exam board might ask you directly about, so it's useful to have a really good idea of what's inside that law. As we go through, I want you to write down 4 bullet points that you know you'll remember about the law in the UK on abortion. So, abortion has been legal in the UK since 1967, except for Northern Ireland, if 2 doctors agree that at least one of the following is true. It's important to notice here that we need to have the agreement of 2 doctors when asking for an abortion. It's not enough that one says that they think that you fulfil the criteria for abortion. So the criteria are, the woman might die unless a pregnancy is ended, so this is a danger to the mother's life. There is a substantial risk to the baby being born with a physical or mental illness or disability, so this is a risk to the quality of life of the child. There is a risk to the mother's physical or mental health, so this is not about whether the mother will die, but about her physical or mental health being impaired because of having to have this child. Or there is a risk to the physical or mental health of existing children. The law allows abortion up to 24 weeks in the UK. If you remember, that is the point of viability. The majority of abortions in the UK take place due to this condition here. There's a risk to the mother's physical or mental health, and specifically, the mental health of the mother is the reason why many doctors allow abortion to take place. There is an argument to be able to say that a mother not wanting a child is enough to have a possible risk on her mental health in the future if she is forced to go ahead with a pregnancy. Pause the video now to make sure you have 4 bullet points written to remember the UK law on abortion. Time for another keywords test. What is the definition for embryo? Can you develop that definition? An embryo is the fertilised ovum or human egg. It's the earliest stages of human development. A development of this could be that it happens at around 12 to 14 days after conception. I want to think about the law on abortion a little bit more, and I want you to think about why the time limit for legal abortion in the UK is 24 weeks. Now, to do this, you need to think about the different stages when life could be seen to begin. Give an answer and explain why you think that is why the UK has chosen to have 24 weeks as a legal limit for abortion. Pause the video now and give your answer. So 24 weeks is the point at which the fetus becomes viable. This means that it could survive with medical assistance if born at that stage. Now, in the law, this means that if it can live independently of the mother, people believe that it's definitely alive. And it does make a lot of sense to say this. There's an argument to say that before this point, the fetus is merely a part of the mother's body. It's completely dependent on her in order to be alive, and therefore, if she wasn't alive, it wouldn't be alive. After this point, because it would be able to survive without her, people would say that it becomes alive, a living thing. The next thing that you need to know about are the alternatives to abortion. Now, sometimes a pregnant woman may be in a situation where they're considering abortion but don't want to go through with it. And you need to be able to name some of the different alternatives and think about the advantages and disadvantages of them in terms of whether a woman would want them to take place or not. As we look at each, write a bullet point to explain each one. So the first alternative to abortion is really simple, and it's keeping the baby. Now, this isn't ideal because obviously if somebody's considering abortion, it's likely that there's a reason why they don't want a baby. Others may argue that this is the most sensible thing to do, as often when people keep a baby that they didn't originally think that they wanted, they end up loving that child and taking care of it as well as many other people would. The next option is fostering. This is when people give up their child so that they go into care, but they remain the legal parents of that child. This idea is quite closely linked to adoption. Adoption is when people give up their child, but somebody else becomes the legal parents of that child. If a child is adopted, then before the age of 18, they have no legal right to know who their biological parents are, only their adopted parents. The final alternative to abortion is that of putting the mother's life at risk. Now, if the reason why somebody is considering an abortion is because they think that they may die, or because they think that they may have some sort of physical illness because of having that child, then some people choose to risk their own life in order to try and have that child. Many people would say that this is a really admirable thing to do, almost sacrificing your own life for that of your child. Others may say that it's not a very clever thing to do at all, particularly if the mother has got other responsibilities, such as a family to look after. The next thing that you'll need to know about for your exam is thinking about who would have the right to consider whether an abortion takes place or not. There are 4 different groups of people on the screen at the moment: the mother, the father, the fetus, and God. I want you to pause the video for a minute or two and to consider why it's important that we think about this. I want you to write down one reason for each one of these groups, why each might have rights in deciding whether an abortion goes ahead or not. Pause your video now and think about those 2 things. So let's think about the reasons why each one of these people may have rights when considering abortion. The most obvious one of these is the mother. Now, the pregnancy is obviously happening inside of her body, and therefore she should have the right to decide whether it goes ahead. This is enough for many people to suggest that the mother should be the only person who has any right to decide whether an abortion takes place or not. Alongside this, it's possible that she will be the person who's expected to take most care of the child. Legally, the mother has many more rights over the child than the father if considered outside of marriage. And in society, there is maybe an expectation that the mother would take more care of the child than the father. Finally, it is likely that it will have the largest effect on her life. Here we need to consider the fact that throughout pregnancy, mothers have to change their diet, they may have to change their lifestyle, and this could have a massive impact on the mother's quality of life. The next group of people who some people think should have rights when considering an abortion is the father. Now, the reasons for this are pretty simple. The unborn child contains 50% of the father's DNA. He is half responsible for the production of that child, and therefore he should be responsible for considering whether that child exists or not. Without him, there would be no pregnancy. And finally, the father would be likely to be expected to have some responsibility for the child as well. It seems unfair to consider abortion without considering the fact that the father is responsible for the child as well as the mother. The next thing that we could say needs to be considered before having an abortion is the fetus and the rights of the fetus. If we consider the fetus to be alive, then we should give it the same rights as everybody else, and this could include the right to life. Therefore, neither the mother nor the father have any right to take that right away from the fetus, and abortion should never take place. The final person that people think should have a right to decide whether abortion takes place is God. Religious believers believe that God has given life. God is all-powerful and has a final say in all things. And if he teaches against abortion, then it should not be committed. Many people could refer here to the sanctity of life and the fact that all life is sacred, regardless of the stage it's at. Time for another keywords test. Write down a definition for the sanctity of life. Could you give an example to develop this definition? The sanctity of life is the idea that all life is sacred, that is special and holy, because it's been given by God. Because God has created all life, it should be treated as a gift and respected and protected. Time for another one of our keys to success. This is another Christian teaching, and it is the fact that Christians believe that Jesus told them that they should love their neighbour. Christians were told by Jesus to love their neighbour. This means that they should be kind and loving towards absolutely everyone. I want you to pause the video in a second and answer the question how this belief could affect a Christian's view of abortion. You might want to start it by saying, love your neighbour would affect a Christian's attitude towards abortion by... As a hint, in order to answer this question, think about the situation a woman who wants to have an abortion might be in. What might be forcing her to have an abortion? Pause the video now and answer the question. Time for another keywords test. What is the definition for pro-choice? Can you give an example? Pro-choice is a slogan used that women should have the right to choose whether or not to have abortions. This supports abortion being legal. For example, pro-choice campaigners believe that it is a woman's own body, so it is her own choice whether she goes through with a pregnancy or not. It's worth mentioning here that pro-choice campaigners are not in favour of abortion. They are in favour of abortion being legal. Time to look at our first exam question. This is going to be a 5-mark exam question, and it is explain religious beliefs about when human life could be seen to begin. Before I start you off on this, I just want you to remember a few key things. The first is that this is only about religious views. This is not your opinion. Throughout your answer, you need to be able to use specific religious teachings. You must be able to give and explain at least 3, as it's a 5-mark question, religious views. You must, throughout, focus on the key word in the question. Here, the key words are when life could be seen to begin. We must make sure that we're talking throughout the question about that. Pause the video for 5 minutes and answer the question. Pause the video now. Let's look at a model answer that would receive 5 out of 5 marks. Many Christians believe that life begins at conception. This is because they believe in the sanctity of life, the fact that life is sacred because it has been given by God. This means that from the moment God gives that life, it becomes sacred. Life is given at conception, as before this there is not life. After this, life has started. Many Christians believe that life begins well before birth, when the child is in the very early stages of development. In the Bible it says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart." This suggests that life begins even before the fetus is properly formed, as God knows that individual before that stage. In Islam, Muslims believe that the fetus receives a soul at 120 days. This is known as ensoulment. Some Muslims may take this to mean that the fetus does not truly begin to live until it has reached this stage. Let's just have a look at what's going on in this answer. Here we can clearly see that we've got 3 different points. Each one starts with the religion related to that point. That's really important to give the examiner a clue as to what you're talking about. Next, we've got a teaching in each one of the points. The first is the sanctity of life. The next is this quotation from the Bible, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart." And the final one is this idea of ensoulment. Finally, in each one of the points given, we've got an explanation and then a link back to the question. Wherever we see "this means" or "this suggests," we can see that we've got an explanation. The link back to the question is all about when life could be seen to begin. Here we can see that idea of when life could have started. Before this there is no life, and after this life has started. Here we can see the idea that life begins even before the fetus is properly formed. And here we've got the idea that life does not truly begin to live until it has reached this stage. The Peel structure that we're following here means that it's really clear where each one of our points starts and finishes, and how each one of the points answers a question. It also makes sure that in each one of the points that we make, we've got a specific religious teaching that's well explained. Time for another keywords test. What is the definition for pro-life? Pro-life is a slogan used for the view that supports the right to life of the fetus. This is against abortions being legal. An example of a reason why somebody may be pro-life is that they may say that abortion should not be legal because life is sacred and therefore should never be harmed. Next, we're going to look at the pro-choice and pro-life points that could be given for and against abortion. As we go through the points on each side, I want you to try and bullet point at least 4 arguments for each. Before we start that though, it would be useful for you to know about campaign groups that work either for pro-life or pro-choice. The first of these is prolife.org.uk. This is an organisation set up everybody's right to life. This includes the fetus in abortions. They also consider issues like embryo research and euthanasia. They argue that the right to life is the most basic of all human rights. Everybody deserves it. On the pro-choice side, we have abortion rights. This is a national pro-choice campaign to protect a woman's right to choose abortion. They want abortion to be easy, accessible, woman-friendly and NHS funded. They believe that a woman herself is the best able to decide whether to continue with a pregnancy or not. It's useful to you know about both of these groups so that when you're writing about abortion in your exam, you could refer to real-life examples of people who campaign either for pro-choice or for pro-life with regards to abortion. Firstly, we'll look at some pro-life arguments. Remember, as we go through this, I want you to write down 4 arguments. The first of these arguments is that all life is sacred and special as it was created by God. This, as you will remember, is the idea of the sanctity of life. Life should be protected. This includes the life of the fetus. Therefore, abortion shouldn't be allowed. The next of these is another religious argument. It is do not kill. This is one of the Christian 10 commandments and pretty clearly states that you should not kill under any circumstances. Many people consider abortion to be killing and therefore it goes against this commandment. The next pro-life argument could be that even if the fetus will be born with disabilities, we cannot say what its quality of life will be like. We should not decide before it has had the chance to live. This is an argument against that of a pro-choice campaigner who may say that we haven't got the right to make somebody live with a severe disability, impairing their quality of life. The next argument for pro-choice is that the fetus cannot defend itself and its right to life, so someone else has to. If we consider that the fetus is alive and has the same rights to life as every other living person, then somebody has to speak up for that fetus as it can't do it itself. Next, we have the Catholic Christian view that life begins at conception. This means it has the same rights as a human from that point, so its life should never be taken. Finally, we've got to imagine the potential life which could have taken place. If we imagine that the mother of Einstein, or Steve Jobs even, had decided to have an abortion, then we could justifiably say that the world would be a completely different place. Many people would say that it's not fair not to allow a life to take place when we don't know what that life will achieve. Time for another keywords test. Give the definition for adoption. See if you can develop this definition. Adoption is a legal process where a person or child is taken and adopted into another family as a son or daughter. The development here needs to be the fact that the new family become legal parents of that child. Time to look at the pro-choice side of this argument. Remember, this is the idea that women have got the choice to do what they want with their body. Abortion should be allowed. Write down 4 arguments to explain this view. The first of these arguments is the simple idea that a woman should have the right to do what she wants with her own body. Pregnancy can have a huge effect on a woman both physically and mentally, and it's not fair to force someone to go through that experience. Secondly, safe and legal abortion prevents backstreet abortions, which are unsafe and illegal. Backstreet abortions were the type of abortion that took place prior to abortion being legal. Because they were unregulated and illegal, they often took place with unqualified people and in unhygienic conditions. This put mothers at huge risk in order to have an abortion, and this is something that many people want to avoid us going back to. Nextly, we've got this religious teaching from the Quran. Do not kill unjustly. This is the development of the Christian teaching, which is simply do not kill. If there is a just or fair reason to end a life, like the mother's life being at risk, then some Muslims may be able to argue that abortion could be allowed. Next, we have another religious view, which is love your neighbour. It may be the most loving thing to allow abortion to take place. Examples of this could be if the mother's been raped or if the parents cannot afford to keep a child. Here, we can see that the most loving course of action could in fact be to not allow the pregnancy to go ahead. Next, we've got the Muslim idea that life begins at ensoulment, which is at 120 days. Some Muslims may allow abortion until that stage, especially if the mother's life is at risk. This is because she already has a soul and therefore could be considered more important than the fetus at that point. After that point, the fetus and the mother have equal rights, and therefore abortion is very rarely allowed. Some fetuses are damaged, and it would be cruel to keep the child with such a low quality of life. This is a big reason why many people choose to have an abortion, and a big reason why many pro-choice campaigners would argue that abortion should be legal. It doesn't seem fair to force someone to live with a painful and unpleasant life if there is the option to not put them through that. Finally, before viability, the fetus cannot survive without the mother. It doesn't have a life of its own. Many pro-choice campaigners argue that until after viability, it's still part of the mother's body, and therefore she should be able to decide what happens to it. I want you to think about the pro-life and pro-choice arguments that we've listened to. Write down on your piece of paper which of the arguments you find more convincing. Is it pro-choice or is it pro-life? Give 3 reasons for your view, explaining your opinion. Pause the video now and answer the question. Time for another keywords test. Write down the definition for fostering. Can you develop the definition in any way? Fostering is taking a child from a different family into the family home and bringing them up with the rest of the new family. The development could be that fostering does not affect who the legal parents of the child are. They remain the same. Time for another one of our keys to success. This is an Islamic teaching that Allah is compassionate. Compassion means showing love and kindness towards others. Muslims would see that Allah shows compassion and attempt to do the same in their own lives. I want you to think about how this belief could affect a Muslim's view on abortion. Start your sentence by saying, belief that Allah is compassionate could affect a Muslim by... Pause the video now and answer the question. Time for another keywords test. Write down the definition for quality of life. Try to give an example. Quality of life is a measure of fulfillment. It means how good your life is. An example of this could be the fact that it's based on freedom and ability. To assess the quality of life of a person, you could think about whether a person is free and able to do whatever they want. For example, if a person is in prison, their quality of life may be reduced because they're not free to be able to do whatever they want. One of the things that you may be asked about in your exam is the difference between the sanctity and quality of life. Many people argue that the quality of life is the most important factor to take into account when considering an abortion. If the child will be born with a disability or into a situation where they find life difficult, it's not fair to bring them into the world. If the mother or other family members, like existing children or the father, will have a lower quality of life because of the birth of the child, some people think that this is enough to justify abortion. Others think that the sanctity of life always takes the highest priority when considering abortion. Any life is sacred regardless of disability. God has made it, and it therefore deserves to live. I want you to think about those ideas about the sanctity and quality of life, and write down which one you think should take the highest priority, the sanctity or the quality of life. Make sure you give a reason explaining your answer. Pause the video now and answer the question. Time for our second exam question. This is a 3-mark exam question, so before we start, I just want to go through the things you need to remember in order to answer a 3-mark question. You must make sure that you always answer the question asked. This includes the key words. Here, we have the idea that religious believers are wrong to oppose abortion if it's likely that the baby will have a poor quality of life. We must focus our answer on the quality of life of the child and opposing abortion if it's the case that the quality of life is going to be low. You must make sure that you give your opinion in a 3-mark question, i.e. do you agree or disagree, and give 3 clear and different reasons for your view. In a second, pause the video for 3 minutes in order to answer the question. Pause the video now. Let's go through an answer that would have got 3 out of 3. I agree with the statement, as I believe that everyone is entitled to a good quality of life. If someone makes the decision to have an abortion because they know their child will live in pain and suffer, abortion should be allowed. As well as this, I believe that you should love your neighbour. This is a Christian teaching, and if the quality of someone's life will be poor, abortion should be allowed as it is a loving thing to do. Finally, I believe that the law should decide whether abortion should be allowed. The law allows abortion on the grounds of severe disability, so believers should follow the law and allow abortion on the grounds of quality of life. Let's look at what's happening in this question. First of all, we can see that an opinion is given to begin with. I agree with the statement. The same opinion is given throughout all 3 of the reasons, and we do have 3 clear points related to the question. Next, we can see that throughout we keep on referring back to the quality of life. This is really important to make sure that we're answering the question so that the examiner can see that we know what we're talking about and can give us full marks. Finally, you'll notice that not all of the points given relate to religious teaching. This one has a teaching of love your neighbour, but the other 2 actually have nothing to do with religious ideas. This is absolutely fine for a 3-mark question, but you must make sure in the other answers that you are giving specific religious teachings to justify your opinion. Time for another key words test. Give the definition for fetus. Try to give an example to develop your definition. A fetus is the fertilised ovum or egg. From 8 weeks after conception, the future child is known as the fetus. It's time now to look at some religious teachings specifically related to abortion and early life. Write down the 3 Islamic teachings first of all that you think that you'll remember most easily. It might be useful as well to write down the meaning next to each one so that you're absolutely clear on what they mean. The first teaching that we need to look at is that in the Quran it says, "Take not life which Allah has made sacred." This means that life should not be taken under any circumstances as it comes from God. And it's basically a teaching which justifies the idea of the sanctity of life. So abortion shouldn't be allowed because all life is sacred as it comes from God. The next teaching is the idea that some Muslims believe that life begins at ensoulment, which is at 120 days. This means that some Muslims may consider abortion in extreme circumstances if it takes place before the fetus is considered living. Now, for the most part, the circumstances where it could be considered are where the mother's life is at risk. Before 120 days, because the fetus doesn't have a soul, it could be considered to have a lesser value than the life of the mother, and therefore, abortion could be considered in order to save her life. The next teaching is the idea that in the Quran, it says, "Whosoever has spared the life of a soul, it is as though he has spared the life of all people. Whosoever has killed a soul, it is as though he has murdered all of mankind." Now this plays on the idea that Muslims see taking the life of one person as being as bad as taking the life of all of mankind. If we focus on the idea of abortion being taking a life, then it seems like it's pretty bad and unforgivable if we consider it from the Islamic point of view. The next one is another teaching from the Quran. This is a really useful one as it's really specifically related to abortion. It talks about the fact that you should not kill your children for fear of want. God says, "We will provide for them and you. To kill them is a grievous sin." Now this is basically saying that there are specific teachings in the Quran that teach Muslims that they should not kill their children simply because they're worried about providing them. That idea of fear of want means that if you're scared of not being able to provide for your children, they shouldn't be killed. This is because God will provide for you, and to kill them is considered a grievous sin. Finally, we can look at the teaching from the Quran that says, "Do not kill unjustly." This could mean that some Muslims say that if there is a just and fair reason to end a life, like the mother's life being at risk, then it could potentially be all right to have an abortion. Most Muslims are completely opposed to abortion, but as we can see here, there are some teachings which would allow, under extreme circumstances, Muslims to consider abortion. Time to look at the Christian views on abortion. Again, write down the 3 Christian teachings that you think you will be able to remember most easily. The first teaching that we could look at is that in Genesis, God tells Adam and Eve to go forth and multiply. This is the idea that one of our purposes on earth is to multiply, to reproduce. If God's told us to have children, abortion seems to go directly against this instruction and would mean that Christians were completely opposed to abortion. Next, we've got the idea that Jesus told Christians to love their neighbour as themselves, and abortion could be the most loving thing to do, the lesser of 2 evils. In some circumstances, if we think about rape, or if the child will be born with severe disabilities, we could see abortion as the more loving thing to do. Next, we have the fact that the Bible says that children are created in the image of God. God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. This reflects the idea of the sanctity of life. Life is sacred because God has created us to be special in his image. This means that any life should never be taken. The next one is really simple. It's from the 10 Commandments and it's simply do not kill. Christians may see abortion as killing and therefore it should never be allowed. Finally, in the Bible, God says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart." This gives Christians the idea that God knows us before we even enter the womb. He has a plan for us even before we're conceived. If he has a plan for us, we should not alter it by having an abortion. And some Christians may see it as altering God's will to have an abortion. Time to have a go at our final exam practice question. This is a 6-mark answer. Abortion should only be allowed if the mother's life is in danger. Do you agree? Give reasons for your answer, showing that you've thought about more than one point of view. Explain religious beliefs and teachings in your answer. Before we answer the question, remember to peel your points. So you need to give point, evidence, explanation, and then link back to the question. You need to make sure that all of your points have got religious teachings attached to them to support them. And you need to make sure that you're looking at both sides of the argument. You need to take 12 minutes to do this question. Pause the video now and give yourself 12 minutes to answer the question. Let's have a look at an answer that would have got 6 out of 6. Some Christians would agree that the only reason abortion should be allowed is if the mother's life is in danger. This is because they believe in the sanctity of life. This means that all life is special and sacred because it's been given by God. Therefore, they may think that abortion should be allowed to protect the mother's sanctity of life. Some Muslims may also agree with the statement. This is because they believe that the soul enters the body at 120 days after conception, ensoulment. This means that before this time, the mother's life is more important as she has a soul, whereas the unborn fetus doesn't. Therefore, if the mother's life is at risk, abortion could take place as her life is more important than that of the fetus. Some Christians may disagree with abortion ever being allowed, as they believe that life begins at conception. This means that as soon as the child is conceived, its life is sacred as it has been given by God. Therefore, it should not matter that the mother's life is in danger, as the life you take in having an abortion is just as important as the life of the mother. Some Muslims may disagree, as they believe in the Quran it says, "Take not life which Allah has made sacred." This means that all life is sacred as it has been given by God. Therefore, they would never agree with abortion, as the life of the fetus, as well as the life of the mother, are important. Personally, I believe that the mother's life is important, as she may have other responsibilities like other children, and they would suffer if she died. Therefore, abortion should be allowed if it saves the life of the mother. Let's have a look at what's going on in this answer then. First of all, we need to point out that we're using the Peel structure all the way through the answer. So we've got a point, evidence, explanation, and link. The point is here. Some Christians would agree that the only reason abortion should be allowed is if the mother's life is in danger. So we're just making our point to say whether we agree or disagree with the question. The next part is the evidence. So here we're saying this is because Christians believe in the sanctity of life. Next, we need to explain what that evidence means. So we've got this means that all life is special and sacred because it's been given by God. Importantly, we need to finish with our link. This means we're linking it back to the question and making sure that the point that we're given clearly answers the question. Our question was about abortion being allowed if the mother's life is in danger. So our link says, therefore, they may think that abortion should be allowed to protect the mother's sanctity of life. We should be able to notice a really clear Peel structure all the way through this answer. The next thing I want us to look at is the fact that we're specifying whether we're talking about Christians or Muslims' views, and we're always giving evidence to back up the view that we're giving. This means we're ensuring that we're answering this part of the question, which asks us to explain religious beliefs and teachings in our answer. Finally, we need to notice how many points it is that we're making. You can see here that I've given 1, 2, 3, 4 Peel paragraphs. My final paragraph is not peeled and it's my personal opinion. So this acts as a conclusion on the whole statement. You'll notice that it does still give evidence and an explanation as to why I believe what I do. This is the perfect way to end your essay. It sums up what you think and ensures that the examiner knows that you have been answering the question throughout.